This video will cover deadlines in Microsoft Project, including what they are, how to set them, and how to use them to track key project milestones or handover points. So first of all, what is a deadline? As in real life, a deadline refers to a date that something in the program needs to finish by. In Project, a deadline is basically a tool that gives us some useful information around something that needs to be completed by a certain time. Okay, but how does using deadlines help us? Deadlines are a helpful alternative to the must-finish on hard constraint when we need a task or section of works to finish by a specific date. Deadlines are better because hard constraints place unnecessary limits on the program logic that are more likely to cause you issues down the line. Unlike a hard constraint, deadlines also give a separate graphical indicator on the Gantt chart, so they're easier to use for visualization. We can also use deadlines for different purposes. Because they tell us when something needs to be done by, your first thought may be the project completion milestone. You could indeed use it for this, and doing so would give us a means of comparing our forecasted completion date to the planned finish date as the project evolves. That said, you may also have scenarios where it's a specific task or stream of work that needs to be done by a certain time, rather than the whole project. Deadlines are very powerful here. Using deadlines in combination with the total slack column can help us when planning the works, as we can gain insight into how our tasks are set to play out in relation to the deadline and highlight tasks with significant float or potential for optimization. If the total slack goes negative, we know how far behind our deadline we are. I'll use an example to show you deadlines in action. The situation we've got is that the client wants to move in and do their own fit out at a given date. This date is the planned handover of separable portion 1 of the works, which is this work stream here. The project isn't ending at this handover point, but it is a key point of the job that we need to deliver against, and so tracking against it is clearly important. To do this, you can see I've put in 2 milestones here. Obviously, the earliest time you can do the SP1 handover is when all of the tasks on the SP1 workstream are complete. Because we might get deviations from the plan for any of these SP1 tasks, attaching a milestone to the end of its workstream allows me to see the forecast for the earliest point in time the handover can happen as the project evolves. The second milestone is just the due date for the SP1 handover, which you can see is the 26th of May. So what we're looking at is tracking where the forecast for the earliest finish point is in relation to the due date. These half-bar shadows I put in on the Gantt chart are just a baseline I've set of the program as it is right now, so that we can easily compare this to what happens when I make changes in the duration of these SP1 tasks. The SP1 workstream is non-critical. If we look at the total slack column, we can see that it's got 16 days of slack in this chain of work before the tasks that come after it, which are critical, will be affected. Keep the current total slack in mind for now, as assigning our deadline will change this. Speaking of which, how do we assign a deadline to a task? I'll show you the most common way now. We want to attach the deadline to the milestone for SP1's earliest possible handover. The primary way to input and configure task deadlines is through the task information dialog. This itself can be accessed in a number of ways. The fastest way to access this is by double-clicking on a task name. You can also right-click on a task name and select Information. Or, with any task selected, navigate to the Task tab in the ribbon and select the Information option in the Properties section. Once we've got the Task Information dialog open, we navigate to the Advanced tab and select the drop-down arrow next to Deadline. Here we can specify a deadline date. Ours is the 26th of May, so I'll add that in. After this, we click OK and the deadline will be assigned. You can see by default that the deadline appears as a light green arrow on the Gantt chart on the specified date. We ourselves actually opt to make this a bit darker to make it easier to see. You can do this by double-clicking on the Gantt chart to enter the bar styles dialog. Scroll down until you find the deadlines entry. Select it, and under Start, where you can see the arrow, click on Colour, and we'll choose this darker green. Then we click OK to apply this new format. Okay, with that out of the way, if we look again at the total slack on the SP1 workstream, we can see that this has changed. Before, this task used to have 16 days of total slack, and now it only has 10. The reason that this has happened is that now we've attached a deadline to the milestone for SP1's earliest finish, the program is now effectively calculating 2 critical paths. It's calculating the main critical path through to the end of the job, but now it's also calculating the SP1 chain of works as a critical path to that deadline date. So in the total slack column for this chain of work, it's basically saying that we've now got 10 days before we're overdue. So what happens if we go past the due date? Say this task here takes 10 days rather than 5. Looking at the half bars for the baseline, you can see now how everything has moved over to the right. You can also now see that the total slack on the SP1 workstream is 5 days instead of 10. The critical path on the workstream below this hasn't changed at all, so these changes are related purely to this due date. Let's say instead of taking 10 days, the task takes 20 days. You can see the rest of the SP1 workstream gets pushed further to the right, and it actually turns red, which would usually indicate that it's become critical. That said, you can see that the workstream below hasn't turned blue as this one has turned red. They're both red. This is because of the deadline. The SP1 workstream hasn't actually overtaken the main critical path, but in the total slack column you can see I've got a -5 days figure. This means that I'm running 5 days late on this deadline, so the fact that the SP1 workstream has turned red is because we're behind where we need to be. So if this task has taken 20 days and we're behind, what this tells me is that we need to be looking for ways of shortening these tasks to bring the forecasted finish of the SP1 workstream back into line before the handover due date. So if say we work out that we can save time on this task and have it finished in 5 days rather than 10, the rest of the SP1 workstream will pull back, and now I'm actually showing as hitting my deadline. In the total slack column you can now see that it says 0 days. Again, if instead of saving 5 days we can only save 3, I can change this to 7, and now the Gantt and total slack show the workstream is running late by 2 days. If we're behind the deadline, a warning indicator will be shown in the indicators column to let you know. With deadlines included in the program properly, it can help with keeping us up to date with the need to take corrective actions. So in summary, the deadline creates a second critical path that measures to a fixed point that we define. This lets us take steps to control what's happening both in here and in the main critical path. This is also how we use it to say where we're at, so we can see whether we're actually ahead of time for meeting a deadline or whether we're late, and it gives you these useful markers to tell you how late you are. One alternative way to assign deadlines in the case of mass edits is to insert the deadline column. You can do this by right-clicking anywhere in the task view, selecting Insert Column, and then begin typing Deadline, and then you can select it from the suggestions. Now you can edit this information directly and much faster. To regain space in your task view once you're finished assigning deadlines, you can hide the column again by right-clicking on the Deadlines column header and selecting Hide Column. Even though you can't see the column anymore, any information that you've entered is still within the program. And that's everything for this video. If you've got any queries on the topic or you'd like to know a bit more about it, you can always drop us an email at justask@menlo-academy.com. Let us know what you'd like to know about it, and we'll see what we can do to answer your questions. See you in the next one.